One of my flying goals for several years has been to fly up and around Mount Wrightson in southern Arizona. Recently, I caught an opportunity to do this flight, and in this video I want to walk through my flight, talk about flight conditions, and some of the challenges that I had on the flight. So let's start with accessibility. As you can see here, I'm not actually launching from Mount Wrightson. Mount Wrightson is managed by the U.S. Forest Service, so there are trails throughout the wilderness, including trails that go to the peak. I've hiked all of the main trails in the park and never found anywhere that could be used for a launch, mainly because the forest is so dense in the area, and you'll see quite a bit of that in the video here. There are some options if you approach the mountain from the east in Gardner Canyon, but these areas are relatively difficult to reach. So the best option for accessing the mountain is just north of Madera Canyon, and in particular you can see that I'm launching from Box Canyon, which is a maintained paragliding launch in the area. I'm showing some video of the launch to show conditions for the day. Here I'm launching just after noon, and even with thermals fully developed, I get within one turn of sinking out. That's one of the major downsides of launching here at Box Canyon on light days. But I was able to grind it out and ultimately got to around 2,200 meters or 7,000 feet. For reference, the launch is around 5,000 feet. So moving on to weather, one of the reasons it's taken me so long to attempt this flight is the timing. I've been looking for a day with consistent wind blowing from the north into Madera Canyon to make benching up the west face easier. You can probably do this flight when winds are from the west, which is more common, but you have to take more care to avoid rotor on the north-south facing ridges. So what are ideal conditions? What I was looking for was a day when the top of lift was at or above the height of the mountain, and I wanted to make sure that the winds at altitude weren't gusting too strong, making it difficult to return to launch. While there are plenty of landing options outside of Madera Canyon, as you'll see in the video as I'm approaching Madera Canyon now, getting from Box Canyon to Madera Canyon is a long hike across the desert or through a patchwork of dirt roads, so something you want to avoid. This is a pretty light day with 1 to 2 meter per second thermals, and the top of lift was forecast around 9,500 feet at midday. With a tailwind of a consistent 6 to 10 miles per hour at flight altitude, the flight into Madera Canyon was quite nice. Wind gusts were below average for the season, making for an easy return to launch after I was done. Despite Mount Wrightson being one of the tallest peaks in southern Arizona, a lot of people haven't even heard of it. So Mount Wrightson is 9,500 feet tall and situated between the I-19 to the west and Arizona Highway 83 to the east. It's a bit smaller than Miller Peak by Sierra Vista and taller than Mount Lemmon in Tucson. But one of the defining characteristics that you're starting to see in the video here is that the wilderness area on all sides of the peak is massive. Since it's in the title of the video, what is big mountain flying? Now, this is just my opinion, but what differentiates flying around a mountain like Wrightson versus cruising around South Mountain in Phoenix, for example, is that mountain weather conditions dominate. If you're flying around South Mountain in Phoenix on a day when the wind is from the south, those conditions generally prevail throughout the valley. When you're flying on a big mountain, the winds in one valley are probably different from the valley next to it, and the conditions likely aren't the same as those around the mountain. You'll see some of that in the video as I get towards the peak. Another differentiating factor is that it's a lot more important to consider exit and landing options when you're on a big mountain. Again, using South Mountain and Phoenix as a reference, if you're over any of those ridges, you'll very likely have no problem gliding to a safe landing spot. In a wilderness area like Wrightson, you have to make sure that you're not getting trapped in a valley against wind and cutting off your landing options. It just requires a higher level of awareness. And I think the final differentiator combines both the previous points I mentioned. When you're on a big mountain, you need to think about what strategies you can use to transition between peaks and bench up higher on the mountain. This requires techniques to figure out wind patterns, watching what areas are lit by sun, and using all the cues that you have at your disposal to find the best and safest route to climb. So at this point in the video, you can see that I've arrived at Mount Wrightson and I'm starting to climb. So let's just talk about strategy. The ridge that I'm on right now forms the eastern boundary of Madera Canyon and leads all the way up to Mount Wrightson. So that's what I'm trying to follow. What I'm doing is pushing out, hunting for thermals, trigger off the lower peaks, then riding up as high as I can get before benching up and approaching the mountain face again to try to find ridge lift. You'll see that there isn't consistent ridge lift, so you have to be ready to do this process over and over to maintain your height and map out sections of the mountain for thermals. You can see the conditions are really weak and I'm spending a lot of time in weak thermals, but I am able to keep benching up. And the first false peak that you're seeing now is McCleary Peak. This is around 1,000 feet shorter than Wrightson, but as I fly over, we get the first views of Mount Wrightson in the distance. It's hard to capture the beauty of this scene in a video. In person, the view is surreal. I'll pause a moment so you can enjoy the view. You'll see in a moment that now I'm at the top of lift, struggling to climb, and I end up turning back a few kilometers short of the peak itself. You can see at this point that I'm flying between two valleys with no landing options. I'm no longer gaining much altitude, and per the day's forecast, I know that I'm likely at the top of lift. On my right is Madera Canyon, and on my left is a valley that is completely isolated with no roads or trails. You can see I make a decision based on the lift I'm perceiving to turn to my left into the isolated valley. At first this seems like a good option. I tuck in close to the ridge to avoid rotor, and my glide ratio is pretty good. In front of me you can see there's a low ridge I need to clear to make it back to the northwest side of the mountain and back to launch. At first I thought I was in a great place to make this transition, but as I get lower, my glide ratio plummets and I start to wonder if I'm going to have to consider turning into the valley and finding another source of lift. This is obviously not something I want to do because there are no good landing options in this valley. So at this point you can see that I go all the way on speed bar and end up clearing the ridge with a small but safe margin. You can hear me breathe a sigh of relief. I'll slow the video down here as I fly through this isolated canyon so you can enjoy the scenery. The rest of my flight back to Box Canyon was relatively uneventful, even flying into a headwind. I was able to fly pretty much straight from Mount Wrightson to Box Canyon with very little turning. When I did get back to Box Canyon, I had the opportunity to fly with a few hawks, which is what you'll see in this last clip. Unfortunately, my battery died at this point, but at one point one of the hawks swooped into my canopy and made an attempt, or what looked like an attempt, to grab at the fabric. I've flown with hawks a number of times and never seen behavior like this before, so I made sure to give them even more distance. But it was really something to see. So, if you're in southern Arizona, near Box Canyon, and if the conditions are right, I highly recommend flying over and around Mount Wrightson. The scenery is beautiful, the flying is relatively easy, and it's probably some of the best big mountain flying you'll find in Arizona. Thanks for watching.